myself momentarily. We've got Bob Rheault is with us today. He spent 26 years in the U.S. Army, starting out at West Point and finishing up as colonel. And he also spent 32 years with Outward Bound, starting as an assistant instructor and finishing his time there as president. So he will fill us in on some more of the details.
Well, you know what, Veterans Day, was originally Armistice Day because on 11/11/11, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent in Europe. I think my father, who was there in the front lines, probably appreciated that. Anyway, I think it's appropriate that we should take some time to, on Veterans Day or close to Veterans Day, to honor those who serve and who have served, and some who may serve in the future. The term serve is something I'd like to come back to. It's not unusual to ask an old soldier, and at 85, I am indeed an old soldier, to come and speak on Veterans Day or Memorial Day, and sometimes to beat the drum and wave the flag and talk of patriotism and all that good stuff. But I'm afraid I'm not that guy. There's a myth, I think, that soldiers love war. And I'm here to tell you that's simply not so. For those who've actually experienced combat, war is a terrible reality. I think for many, war is an abstraction, born perhaps of bad movies, raunchy television, cheap novels, parades, flag waving, statues of handsome generals sitting on top of great big horses, waving their swords, and all of that sort of good stuff. I worried something about Ronald Reagan, whose view of war was probably formed by his acting in Hollywood movies where you shoot blanks and then go out and have drinks together afterwards. That's not the reality. I think perhaps the best memorial to war is in Washington, D.C., where Maya Lane's wall is hundreds of feet of polished black marble on which are inscribed some 58,000 names of those who fell in combat. And so you might say, well, how come you got into the military? And that's a fair question. And I am indeed a product of my generation and a product of the times. Because when I was about your age, they bombed Pearl Harbor. And the United States was precipitated into World War II, which had been going on for a while. And if you were a young, healthy male, you had three choices about that time. You could wait to get drafted, that wouldn't take very long. You could go downtown and join up and pick your branch of service, or you could try to get into one of the officer training programs going on in the colleges or in the military academies. But in a very short period of time, you're not going to worry about how you're going to wear your hair or what clothes to put on when you get up in the morning. That was going to be pretty much decided. I think ahead of you, I had a lot more choices, and I urge you to take them wisely. But in 1943, when I reached 17, I put on my first uniform at West Point and stayed in the military. You might ask why I stayed, and I'll try to give you a picture of my career, brief one, as to why I stayed in. I went from West Point to Germany. I was embarrassed to have missed World War II, as most of my comrades, many of my classmates had. No. I went overseas to Germany. Initially, I had an isolated platoon on the Czech border where refugees from communism were streaming across, and where our way of life for most of the people who lived there for generations was smuggling. I went from there to an isolated platoon on the border across the way from the Russians. This was when the Cold War was getting a little bit hotter. Across from my 40 men and light weapons was a Russian battalion with about 400. When they got drunk, they used to shoot across the border at us. I went home from my tour in Germany, back to the States, taught at the Officer Candidate School, and then shipped out to Korea. Korea is an absolutely miserable place to fight a war. It's brutally cold in the winter. It's nasty hot in the summer. The rainy season is lousy, and it's all mountains. It breeds a very tough breed of people. It's not a great place to fight a war. And the war ended rather inconsequentially, in that to this day we have a line drawn across the peninsula and people snarling at each other on either side. From Korea, I had a great opportunity. They sent me to France for a year, and I came back and taught at the military academy for 3 years. Great place to teach. The students are motivated or else. And from there, I finally got into Special Forces, which was recently created, the Green Berets, if you will, and really found my niche. Prior to the Vietnam War, I was in Germany, where we conducted missions all over the place, training special ops people in Turkey, in Greece with the Greek Raider Force. We trained the Pakistani Rangers in the Baluch Mountains. We trained the Special Forces for the Iranian Army. We trained the Turkish people. We worked with the French Foreign Legion on Corsica, and there was the British SAS. We pulled a mission in India when the Chinese invaded India. We were all over the place. And because our mission was to drop behind enemy lines if the war started, we talked the Army into letting us do all this great stuff. I was on skis 80 days a year, training for skiing. We did mountain training, rock climbing, and that sort of thing. We did scuba. We did high altitude, low open parachuting. Probably did at least 100 parachute jumps during that next 3 years, half of them at night. It was pretty exciting stuff. And there were good troops. Went back from there briefly to the States, and then off to my first tour in Vietnam with Special Forces. Back to the States, went to the War College, moonlighted a master's degree at George Washington University, and then back to Vietnam for my final tour. Good stuff, actually. Not always fun, not always easy, damn sure not boring. And the best part of it was working with good people. No matter how good a job you get and how much you love the work, if you don't get to work with good people who are as excited about it and working as hard as you are, it won't be any fun at all. But there's a brief of my service history. You can ask questions later on. Soldiers don't talk much about combat. If you hear somebody who's been in combat telling war stories about there they were and the machine guns were there and the bayonets were there, they probably weren't there. Soldiers don't talk about it because nobody really understands. And what I'm going to try to do for you a little bit today is to separate the war from the warrior. War itself is a massive horror show. And it affects actually the civilian population these days far more than the soldiers. Soldiers are killed in war, but millions of civilians are either killed or uprooted from their homes, their crops destroyed, their livestock destroyed, their families dispersed. War is a huge and horrible thing, and it affects one and all. I don't think there's anybody who thinks that war is the way to go. Combat is a somewhat lesser item that's part of war. But it's interesting to note that if you lined up 100 people who have worn the uniform of this nation, probably only 2 or 3 have actually seen combat. The rest are doing important stuff under perhaps difficult conditions, perhaps maybe uncomfortable from time to time. But the people who actually are engaged in combat are a very tiny proportion. And that is a very different cup of tea. Because when I think about my time in combat, and I talk to others who have been there, there's this terrible contradiction. When I was in combat, I was at the absolute top of my game. I have never worked harder, never been in better shape, never been so focused, never took any time off, never worried about anything except the task at hand. The task was absolutely essential. We're talking in the Army about soldiers don't fight against an enemy in front of them, they fight for the people who are around them and behind them. The great acts of courage that you hear about are not carried out in order to kill somebody else, but rather to save the lives of others. People who win medals for heroism are usually doing something that will save other people's lives. There's a question that I hate to hear from people who say, well, how many men have you killed? And I like to take the response to that is, why don't you ask me how many lives I've saved? Because I think if I do my job well, I will save lives. And yes, it is a terrible thing to be involved in combat where other people are actually trying to kill you and you are actually trying to kill them. And that is a terrible contradiction that exists and say, why did it take something so terrible to bring out the best in me? Does that make me crazy or what? And I think it is one of the things that causes problems for soldiers who come home from the war back to civilian life and find that they are doing something that is never quite as important, never quite as difficult, never quite as focused. I mean, almost any job that you can take, you can always take time off, or you can always skip a day because you're feeling bad. And it really doesn't matter very much if you don't do it right, or you might get fired. But you don't really care much about the people on either side of you. You might be bucking for the same promotion you are. So I think that many soldiers returning from combat have a hard time readjusting to what seems to be inconsequential in their lives at home. And that's really tough to deal with. You've probably heard about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a mental illness suffered by those who experience extreme trauma of all kinds, and particularly the trauma of combat. And the way that the statistics will probably tell you that between 15 and 30% of the people who serve in combat do suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder and have a difficult time getting their lives together. You probably also have heard that a great rise in the number of suicides. And this is indeed a problem. I know a good deal about it. I ran a program for Outward Bound for Vietnam vets suffering from post-traumatic stress for about 18 years, working with a lot of those guys. So I know it's a serious problem. But I'd like to talk to you about another side of that coin, because most people do not suffer from post-traumatic stress. Most people do get on with their lives, and they suffer perhaps, or profit perhaps, from what I call PTSD, post-traumatic growth. Because I submit that anything that you do that is extraordinarily difficult, and that you have to press up against your limits and then go beyond those limits because it is so important, you can't back off. That you come away from that, if you're not broken, then you're stronger. You'll be more mature, more sure of yourself, more humble in some ways, more compassionate for others. So I submit that doing hard stuff gets you to a better place. And it is perhaps that I'm looking for my water bottle here. It's perhaps that led me to the next phase of my life. I gravitated from being in command of all the special forces in Vietnam to being an assistant instructor at Outward Bound for $250 a month. And it was a great transition for me and also appropriate for me at that time. But what attracted me to Outward Bound was what Kurt Hahn had created. Kurt Hahn is the grandfather of Outward Bound, and Kurt Hahn was inspired by William James' line, which is the moral equivalent of war. And what does that mean? What is the moral equivalent of war? Essentially, it is, can we not find some way to bring forth in people those qualities, brought forth in warfare, the qualities of courage, self-sacrifice, devotion to duty, devotion to one's fellow soldiers, the ability to hang in there and do hard stuff over extended periods of time under difficult conditions. Can we not find a way to bring forth those wonderful qualities without the horror, the killing, the destruction, the evil of war? Can you not create the warrior spirit without the war? A question that has fascinated me all my life. If we could bring some of the warrior spirit towards solving the problems that face this nation today, if we could bring across some of the unity that existed during World War II, today this country is fractured, snarling at each other from two sides of the aisle, and nothing gets done. During World War II, everybody gave up something. Out of a population of 130 million people, 12 million served in the military at some stage. Women went off to work to do work that women had never done before. There were no cars in this automobile-crazy country, no cars built for the civilian economy from 1942 to 1946. There was a 40-mile-an-hour speed limit. And people obeyed it because you couldn't buy a tire. And you could get a retread and they were falling off all over the highway. If you were a 16 or 17-year-old, you might have your license, but you damn sure weren't borrowing the old man's car. So it was cash ration. So we were back on our bikes. There was a sense of unity. I can remember my high school class being told, no sports this afternoon, we're going out to shovel snow over railroad tracks to keep the war effort going. And it was done with goodwill. There wasn't a lot of griping about it. So, can we not find some way to bring forth those good qualities of unity and those good qualities in human beings without war? And I think that a good Outward Bound course does bring forth those qualities, because it does face people up against things they're scared to do and do. They work together as a team. They bond together and work well together. They do hard stuff. They do harder stuff than they may have ever done before. They're cold and wet and dirty and tired and hungry, and they don't quit. And I've been around Outward Bound long enough to watch, the kids come together on the first day of an Outward Bound course, and they're sniffing at each other like a bunch of Doberman pinchers, I wonder who he is, and he looks kind of fat. And then on the end of the course, they're saying goodbye, and they're hugging and crying and swearing eternal friendship. And, what brought them together? Was it had so much fun? Hell no. It was because it was so hard. It's because shared adversity is what brings people together. You don't get close to people by going to parties with them. You can have fun, but you don't get close to people. You get close to people by doing hard stuff with them. And the shared adversity of soldiers who've been in combat or good Outward Bound students is really something of the same. So I stuck with Outward Bound for quite a while. And what I'm here to say is that hard is not bad. Hard is good, actually. We are formed and matured and created as human beings, as good, strong men and women, not by the fun stuff that we do, but by the hard stuff that we do, and that forms us and creates us. So far be it from me to wish that any of you will have to serve in war or in combat. You might take an out-of-bound course. I hope it will be a good, hard one. But as you face choices in the rest of your lives, I urge you to look for the hard stuff. Don't take the easy way. You keep taking the easy way, you'll get used to it. And you won't go anyplace. So I say, grab for the hard stuff. And I think this old soldier's talked long enough. I'll throw myself open to your questions.
I know that the Special Forces train at Fort Bragg in Georgia.
Yes.
So is that where?
North Carolina.
Oh, North Carolina.
Yeah.
Is there any other forts that you train in, or bases training in the U.S.?
That's the place where the initial training takes place. In other words, if you want to get into Special Forces, it's quite a long road to go. In other words, first you have to go through basic training and advanced infantry training, then you have to volunteer for airborne training. If you make it through airborne training, maybe you take a shot at ranger training, and then go through the Special Forces Q course, which eliminates about 15 out of 20 that apply, and then you're in. If you were in the Army and you applied to come to Special Forces, and you were young, corporal or PFC or something like that, they say, that's great, kid. Go get yourself some training. Go join an airborne unit. We haven't got time to teach you to be a soldier. We'll take you after that. There is no slot in an A team below the rank of sergeant. So everybody in an A team is at least a sergeant or higher. And there are no second lieutenants in Special Forces either. So essentially, Special Forces training starts there. Once you get in, you get the Q course, then you have to pick a specialty, because the A team has 2 medics, 2 communicators, 2 demolitionists, 2 weapons. So then you would go and get your training as one of those specialties, and then join a team. So that's the process. So as I say, triple volunteers and a good bunch of people to work with. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
What was your specialty, Bob?
What's
What
that?
was your specialty then?
Well, see, I came in, I was an officer, so I was a team leader. And so everybody in the team had to be cross-trained in every skill. In other words, I had to learn how to do Morse code, for example, at a basic level. I had to also learn the demolitionists. We cross-trained each other in the team so that everybody was prepared to do some level of everything that the team did. But I did not train as a specialist. Yeah.
What do you think is the long-term impact of people coming back who have done an outward bound course, say 20 or 30 years later in your career? Did you see people who come back and talk about that experience in a
I have a
similar way?
lot of that, actually. I had a guy come back the other day to see me. It was in the first course I ever taught as an instructor, which kind of blew my mind because I didn't really know what I was doing in my first course. And he was raving on about how it had changed his life. He said, I was this rotten, no good 17-year-old drug-addicted kid, and it changed my life. And I've had a lot of experience, so I'm old enough that fathers who were on my outward bound courses would come and bring their kids to do outward bound. There's been an attempt to do research on it, and research ongoing in order to try to quantify something like that. And it's been very hard to do because most of what you have is subjective stories. And the only place where outward bound has worked, where you can satisfy the people who like statistics, is where we work with juvenile delinquents in the state of Florida. And there you could measure it because you had what they call the test group, the ones who did outward bound, and the control group, those who did not do outward bound. And then you can get recidivism, how many of them are back in jail within 6 months and a year, and then you can put a price tag on it. And that did prove that the outward bound alternative to incarceration was effective. The question is, how could you find enough dedicated young people who would work that hard for that low pay and do it for all the juvenile delinquents? But that's probably the most realistic statistical evaluation. Yeah.
Are you still friends with the men in your team?
The men I serve with, yeah, many of them, I'm 85, and many of them are no longer around, but I still have some contacts, yeah. Yes,
Out of all the places you were stationed in, which was your favorite place?
I'm sorry.
Out of all the places you were stationed in all the countries, which country was your favorite?
Which was your favorite country of all the places you were stationed?
Oh, well, Europe was wonderful, and Korea was kind of the other end of the spectrum. And being an outdoorsman, the mountains of Europe, fantastic. And back in peacetime, in the Army, you get 30 days leave a year. I spent every 30-day leave on skis. And I spent a lot of time in the mountains. So I love France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Switzerland, that circle there.
Time for one more question.
Yes.
Earlier you mentioned the national unity during World War II. Where did that come from? Was that from the top down or from the communities?
I think it was born out of the sense that there was a real threat to the world existing as we knew it, that had we not, put a stop to what Hitler planned to do in Europe and what the Japanese were planning to do in the Far East, that, the United States might have hunkered down, but we would never have, the world would not have survived. So I think there was a sense of a threat. And I submit that if people would wake up to the threat today to the world as we know it, if we don't, do something about it. But I think everybody, there were always a few people who tried to cheat, but they damn sure, during the Vietnam War, people burned their draft cards in public. Nobody would have done that during World War II. There may have been a few people who tried to get out of it, and there may have been some people who cheated on gas rationing. But it wasn't something that you dare do in the open. It was almost embarrassing to be a healthy male and not be in uniform during that period of time. So everybody joined in. And Roosevelt was president, he was president for 3.5 terms. But there wasn't that great political divide at the top that we have now. And although prior to the United States entering into World War II, there was some opposition to doing that. But once we got into it, once they bombed Pearl Harbor, I think, you know, the day after Pearl Harbor, people flooded the enlistment station. The draft had already been instituted. But you know, people just went down and signed up. It was a good time and a bad time. And it was a good time to be part of this country and to feel that you were part of something that everybody was doing.
If you have additional questions, please feel free to come down forward afterwards, and thank you so much for your inspiration.